Welcome to a book review of the most amazing book that I've just finished, Hothouse by Brian Aldiss. This was an absolutely amazing read. I loved every bit of it. And my review today is a bit more scripted than they normally are, because otherwise I'd probably just burble squeeing at you about how amazing this book is and how everyone should really read it. So I prepared some notes so that this review won't be like that. The first word that came to my mind when I was reading this and when I finished reading this and when I'm trying to think about how to describe it to people is stupendous. First of all, I'm going to say, look at that beautiful cover art, because, yeah, I really love the old cover art on classic sci-fis. Now, this particular classic sci-fi, I know I have read it before, but it was a really long time ago. And I was probably quite young. I probably cared less about the beauty of prose and the quality of the writing than I do now, and more about a good, fast-paced, exciting story with innovative science concepts, because that was me when I was young. It's still a little bit me, but these days I really zoom in on beautiful writing. I appreciate H.G. Wells, John Wyndham, Charles Dickens. The beauty of the writing itself can be a thing for me, and the beauty of the writing in Brian Aldiss was always present. And of the books of his I've read, I think this is probably the most beautifully written that I have so far read. And so when I read it was probably quite young. It was definitely before I did my science degree. So reading this as a scientist is interesting because as a general rule, we've got a 5 kingdom classification of living things. Kingdom Plantae is all the plants, and that's the kingdom that is often neglected in fantasy and fiction writing, and somewhat in sci-fi. You've got some authors that will do amazing things with plants in sci-fi, but I don't think anyone has ever done anything quite as dramatic as this. Because we start in this lush, continent-wide forest, which is a single banyan tree. And it's expanded to fill in the entirety of the space it can. It stops at the seashore when it can no longer continue. I think at the mountains as well. But basically it's a continent-wide banyan forest. And in its branches live hosts of evolved and mutated, weird and bizarre plants which struggle violently for existence. Because I think he actually uses the phrase nature red in tooth and claw in this book as green in tooth and claw. It's vicious, it's barbarous, it's everything that early mankind thought that nature was, but nature didn't live up to. Here it is. So these plants are often semi-sentient. It's so far in the future that they've evolved a kind of sentience, and many of them are mobile. It feels like they are almost without exception fatal to the few remnants of the animal kingdom that have survived into the continent-wide forest of banyan in this far future. So Kingdom Plantae has definitely come into its own, and one of the few animals that has survived into this far future in this particular forest, we find more of them later in the book, is a type of human. So it's much reduced in size, and it's considered devolved from modern humans, and de-evolution is a thing in this book, and I'll get to it later. But there's Homo sapiens. They're much smaller than they used to be. They've got far reduced mentation and speech. Their speech is very limited. They have almost no craft and learning. They live almost wholly on instinct. They don't have any industry. They don't have a lot of manufactured goods. They've got carving, for example, but their weapons seem to be largely sticks and large thorns that they pick off plants. We start in a small tribe of a few adults, I think it's 5 or 6, and a few kids that are more at the beginning than they are 10 minutes later. This small tribe is led by Lily-O. They are completely arboreal. They live in the trunks of the banyan tree. Each of them has a little sleeping pod that they've carved out of some kind of seed pod, and glued to the trunk with some kind of sap. This hunter-gatherer type nature relies on plants and constant alertness for all the many plants that want to kill you. In fact, early in the book we see a small tribe of children running across a branch, and one of them falls off and is then consumed by a plant whose jaws rise through the leaf that she's resting on and grab her. This introduction is Aldiss's way of showing us just how brutal this world is, because no one takes this as particularly unusual. They just go on with life and do the things that they do. So he's used this tribe to introduce us to this life, and he also uses these humans, which we don't strongly identify with at this point at least. He uses them to introduce us to all the vicious types of flora and fauna that he has imagined, and all the amazing ways that plants can have evolved to kill small, defenseless, squishy humans. So he has also built a fascinating cultural background for this little tribe, and it's lightly written. It's not culture heavy, it's plant heavy, but it's small things like leadership customs. The leader is almost female, gender roles, males are to be protected. There may only be one or two in the tribe, and they are the mates of the whole tribe, or so it seems. There's funeral rites, there's customs surrounding leadership, takeover, which take us into the next part of the story. So the child who's died in the beginning has a soul. A soul here is a small wooden carving that's made by one of the males and is given the child by its mother, I think. They carry it with them the whole life, and the soul is often all they have after the vicious death in which a plant normally consumes them, and they use that for funeral rites. After the death of this child, Lilio decides that she's no longer sufficiently good as a leader. She's causing too much damage, so she decides to hand over leadership to the oldest girl, who's called Toy, and as a girl child has to lead. And she and the other adults all decide to go up, because that's the way it's done. Going up in capital letters, it is what they also did with the soul of the child who died, and it turns out that this ritual means climbing right to the top of the banyan tree into the harsh light, a journey that is perilous and dangerous and few make it. But the whole tribe does that, and all the adults seal themselves into seed pods of this plant called a traversa. This plant, the amount of detail that Aldiss puts into describing the individual plants and what they do and how they live their life is stupendous. This particular plant is described as having many similarities to spiders of today. They throw wisps up into the air, and they've got pods that float up. So the adults get sealed into these pods to complete their going up, which we, the reader, understand to be a form of death, since they do that for the souls of the tribe members who've died. And then the spiders and the pods float up into the atmosphere in the direction of the moon, which is now much closer to Earth than it is in our day. Now, I'm not really keen to say any more about their journey, because the journey is spectacular. It should be read for itself. It's not a huge part of the plot, but it starts off in the first part and it sort of wends its way through other parts of the book. Now, Toy and the rest of the children start to return to their home in the banyan tree down below, but as they're climbing, they end up being carried away, literally, by a plant. They go hunting a plant. It's a flying plant. They end up on the back of it, and they all end up being carried away to the end of the banyan forest kingdom, to the seashore. This is described as being partly due to the actions of a rebellious boy child. Gren is rebellious. He rebelled against Toy's rule and doesn't always do what she says. He's got his own ideas about things, and he's a risk taker. He's the bad boy, basically, of these future arboreal, slightly green humans. So the seashore description is also marvellous. With marine biology background, Being able to do something exciting with the seashore is always going to grab me. Aldiss describes all these different types of seaweeds that have evolved the ability to thrash and grab things on the shore. Every plant in this amazing book is hungry for prey, and you've got different types of seaweeds that can do it in different ways. Some of them have got spikes to grab their prey and pull them down. Others have got little sacs, the flotation sacs that we see on larger seaweeds today, that have evolved to contain poison that will burst on their prey and disable it. We also see one of the other species, one of the few ones that Lilio's tribe do cooperate with. It's an evolution of a termite. And the termite mound that Gren gets into, though not the other children, is where he first encounters a vision of the morel. More on the morel later. So yes, this journey is the start of a journey that Aldiss takes us on to let us see all his different evolutions and variations on this planet. Toy's little tribe don't make it back to the banyan forest that we've already seen. Instead, they make it to a different tribe, a much more populous one, that does live on the ground, which Lilio's group have always considered the ground to be instant death. Here we find a group that have evolved to live on it. They're more successful than Lilio's as well. And so we're introduced to more plants, more ways of living. There's a fascinating plant that's described as being kind of a fibrous rabbit-like creature. It's still got the bunny ears though. I don't think that plants have much in the facility of hearing. So there's so much in this book that keeps you thinking about what you're reading. Anyway, so as Gren breaks away from the group and starts wandering with various others, we see many of these other sub-parts of the world. The Earth is very different. It's stopped rotating. It is now tidally locked. There are some planets that have been observed that are tidally locked to their sun, which means that they have no rotation at all. One side is always in sunshine, which of course would be very good for plants, and one side is always in the dark, which makes it icy cold. And we do eventually get to that part of the world as well in this wandering story. The remnant plants, number of remnant animals increase as you go through the book, so you see more and more evolved plants. And through this migration of Gren's is when the morel comes into it. The morel today is a simple sac fungi. Many of them are edible. If you don't know what a morel looks like, Google it. It's a weird kind of honeycomby structure that looks kind of bizarre. I think it's inspired other science fiction writers as well. In this future universe that Aldiss has envisioned, the morel has become highly intelligent and entirely parasitic. So it will take over animals and provide the brain. It's got a really wild concept about how humans first evolved intelligence too, that I'll leave for you to read, because you should read this book. Have you got that? This is a brilliant book. If you only read one classic science fiction in this year, read this one. Yes, the morel. The morel is a truly, truly disturbing storyline. I know a lot of people have found this book disturbing in many ways. I mostly find it wildly exciting and creative, innovative and interesting. But the morel, yeah, that's a bit disturbing. Read this and you'll never look at another morel the same. Possibly never at any fungi again the same. So this is a marvelous, it's an incredibly detailed and strange world that the author has created. Like I said, many people find it disturbing. I just love the richness and boundless creativity of it all. And the story is told in some of the most beautiful prose I ever expect to encounter in the books. Aldiss writes beautifully in general, but the verdant creativity of this story, and I'm going to read you a bit here, I think, if I can see in this dark rainy weather. The sucker bird was now losing height more slowly. It had reached a warm updraft of air and drifted along in it. Its lame and late efforts to turn inland again only carried it parallel with the coast, so that the humans had the doubtful privilege of seeing what awaited them there. Highly organised destruction was in progress, a battle without generals waged for uncounted thousands of years, or perhaps one side had a general, for the land was covered with that one inexhaustible tree which had grown and spread and sprawled and swallowed everything from shore to shore. Its neighbours had been starved, its enemies overgrown. It had conquered the whole continent as far as the terminator that divided Earth's day from its night side. It had almost conquered time, for its numberless trunks afforded it a lifespan the end of which could not be foreseen. But the sea it could not conquer. At the sea's edge the mighty tree stopped and drew back. Over everything, indifferent begetter of all this carnage, shone the sun. Whew, be still my beating heart. So the beauty of the writing and the creativity and detailedness of the story made me able to forgive a few lapses in good science that occur. Things that in a less well-written, in a less well-conceived novel would have had me gnashing my teeth and raving about how annoying this book was. Didn't bother me here at all, really. But I will mention one, de-evolution. Brian Aldiss likes de-evolution, and I believe in the 60s when this was published, de-evolution was a word on a number of science fiction writers' lips, but the concept of de-evolution, it's basically, if you haven't encountered it before, is an evolutionary regression from a more progressive state to a less progressive state. And the concept comes from the archaic and easily disproved notion that either life came into being through a special creation or that humans are the ultimate product or goal of evolution. Oh my God, some people are egocentric. That later belief is related to anthropocentrism, the idea that human existence is the point of all universal existence. I'm sure the sons of Alpha Centauri agree with that, yeah? Anyway, I know that there's a few religious people out there, Christians or whatever, who subscribe to this de-evolution notion, but most scientists these days don't. Evolution goes in one direction. It evolves from something to something else. Whether we personally think that something else is better or worse than the thing it evolved from, it's not going backward, it's always going forward, it's always going in one direction. Genetically speaking, you can see that because no matter what you think of any creature, how evolved or devolved it is, any living thing in its DNA shows the record of its entire history. It hasn't gone back. It hasn't swallowed its DNA. Anyway, it was a concept. This is classic science fiction. It was a concept back then. So, of the classic science fiction I've read, I think this is one of the best. Beauty of prose, etc. And the Hugo Award boards also thought so because in 1962, they awarded this book a Hugo. Though it seems to be awarded for the 5 novellas rather than the integrated book, because this was originally published as 5 novellas in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, I believe, in 1961. I feel that when Aldiss adapted them to make into a novel, he's probably made them even better, because as fix-up novels go, I think this is one of the most seamless and lovely that I've written. I think it probably deserved its own Hugo or similar for itself as a book, not just as novellas. I think they were originally published in 1961. The Hugo was in 1962. I believe that it wasn't until the 70s that it became integrated as a novel in its own right, and I'm pretty sure that it was originally published in America under a different name, though I don't know that name. I'm really grateful to another booktuber who certainly doesn't need my notifications, but if I can find the review, I'll post it online. I think his name's Bookpilled. He did a review for Brian Aldiss where he basically lauded the writing. And he reminded me how much I like Aldiss, though I don't encounter him all that often. And so I grabbed Hothouse again and reread it. I am so grateful. If there's one science fiction book that I absolutely loved with no qualifications this year, this is it. I normally have qualifications, but this book seems to me to be close to flawless. And yeah, Aldiss is hard to get your hands on a little bit, I find, for me. I suspect that's because his writing is so good that people don't get rid of his books. I rely on second-hand shops a lot for books, and you don't see a lot of Aldiss. I think that I won't be getting rid of this one. That's probably why. Anyway, thank you for putting up with 20 minutes of me raving about how good this book is, because it is. If you like classic science fiction and you haven't read this, I really think you should give it a shot. And comment if you have. The algorithm likes it when people comment, and like and subscribe and all that sort of thing. I like the comments. I'd love to know what you thought about this book if you've read it.